A restless mind that keeps you awake doesn't need to be forced into silence. It just needs somewhere gentle to wander. This is that place. Here we explore unusual questions about human behavior, perception, history, and culture. Not just what happened, but what it tells us about being human. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim your screen, pull something warm over you, maybe turn on a fan for a little background hum. There's nothing you need to do tonight except listen. If this helps you sleep, you can subscribe so it's easy to find again. And if you fall asleep before the end, well done. The story will still be here tomorrow night, right where you left off. So settle in and let your thoughts wander with the story. Tonight's topic is a curious one. When the Sahara was a water world. In some of the most remote regions of the Sahara Desert, archaeologists occasionally come across objects that feel slightly misplaced. Not rare objects exactly, just ordinary ones that seem to have wandered into the wrong landscape, buried beneath layers of sand and stone. Researchers sometimes uncover bonefish hooks, harpoons shaped for hunting in shallow water, fragments of pottery that once carried liquids. None of these tools would raise much attention on their own. Humans have been making fishing equipment and clay vessels for thousands of years in many parts of the world. What makes them unusual is where they appear. Because some of these discoveries are made hundreds of miles from the nearest river or lake, in places where rain may not fall for years at a time. The terrain surrounding them is almost entirely dry. Sand, gravel plains, weathered rock, and wind moving patiently across the surface. A process that tends to bury things rather than preserve them, which makes the discoveries themselves a little surprising. And yet, the evidence keeps appearing. Alongside the tools, archaeologists sometimes find the fossilized bones of animals that are even harder to explain. Crocodiles, for example, enormous freshwater fish, and hippopotamuses, animals that spend most of their lives floating quietly in rivers and lakes, surfacing now and then to breathe and glare mildly at anyone who gets too close. Hippos are not widely known for their patience. Taken together, these discoveries create a quiet puzzle. Fish hooks suggest fishermen. Hippos suggest deep water, and deep water suggests something the modern Sahara does not seem especially capable of producing. It suggests lakes, which means that at some point in the past, this enormous desert must have looked very different from the landscape we see today. That idea can feel a little strange at first. The Sahara is so vast and so consistently dry that it almost feels permanent. When you picture it, you probably imagine endless dunes, shimmering heat, perhaps the silhouette of a caravan crossing the horizon, which admittedly does make for a very convincing desert aesthetic. It is easy to assume that this is simply how the region has always been. But buried beneath the sand are small clues suggesting otherwise, and those clues hint at something remarkable. Because landscapes quietly shape the paths of human history. Rivers become highways that connect distant regions. Grasslands become migration routes. Forests shelter communities for generations. Deserts, on the other hand, tend to become barriers. Vast stretches of land that redirect travel, trade, and sometimes entire civilizations. Change the landscape, and the map of human life begins to shift with it. If the Sahara was once full of water, then the geography of this entire part of the world would have been different. Routes would change, animals would spread into new territory, people would move through landscapes that are now almost impossible to cross. In other words, the Sahara you see today may not represent the region's most typical state. It may simply be one phase in a much longer environmental rhythm. And that rhythm can be difficult to notice because human lives are short compared to the slow movements of climate. A few generations are enough for a place to feel permanent. If your grandparents knew the same landscape, and their grandparents did too, it begins to seem eternal. But the earth has its own cycles, moving quietly in the background. Over thousands of years, rain patterns shift, winds reorganize, forests expand and retreat, lakes appear and disappear. Entire ecosystems rise and fade again, often leaving behind only faint traces for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Which brings us back to those fish hooks. Someone once stood in what is now the middle of the Sahara and made a tool for catching fish, not as a curiosity, not as a strange experiment, but because fishing there made sense. Because water was close enough to matter. And if that was true, then the desert we see today is not the whole story. So the question becomes a simple one. What did the Sahara look like before it became the Sahara? The Sahara today is one of those landscapes that you think you understand before you ever see it. You probably grew up with a very clear image in mind. Endless dunes, shimmering heat, maybe the silhouette of a camel caravan crossing the horizon, if the imagination is feeling a little dramatic. And to be fair, those things do exist. There are dunes, and there is certainly heat, but what most people remember when they actually spend time there is not just the dryness, it is the scale of the place and the quiet that comes with it. Part of that feeling comes from the sheer size of the desert. The Sahara stretches across roughly 3.5 million square miles, reaching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Red Sea. Numbers like that sound impressive at first, but they quickly stop meaning much because the mind has trouble picturing something so large. Eventually, it stops feeling like a place you travel across and starts feeling more like a massive presence sitting across northern Africa, shaping weather, travel routes, and the lives of the people living around its edges. Another small surprise is that the Sahara is not actually covered in dunes, the way you might imagine. Only about a quarter of the desert is made of those sweeping sand seas that appear in photographs. Much of the rest is rocky terrain, stone plains, gravel fields, and wide plateaus that stretch toward distant horizons. Some areas look almost lunar, with flat rock surfaces broken only by wind-carved ridges and cliffs that have been slowly shaped over thousands of years. The heat, on the other hand, behaves exactly as you would expect. In the hotter months, temperatures climb to levels that make long walks feel like a questionable idea. The air is extremely dry, so moisture leaves the body quickly. Sweat evaporates almost immediately. Shade becomes something you think about constantly. And in many parts of the Sahara, rain simply does not arrive very often. Some regions can go years without seeing it. What you also notice, if you spend time there, is the quiet. Travelers often describe the Sahara as silent, though that word can be slightly misleading because the desert is not empty. There are foxes moving at night, insects in the cooler hours, birds that somehow know where the scattered water sources are. There are people too, living around oases or moving across the landscape with animals and supplies. But there are stretches where the only sound is wind moving across sand or brushing lightly through dry grasses. Sometimes the loudest thing you hear is the scrape of your own footsteps against stone. Living in a place like this means that water becomes the most important feature in the entire landscape. It determines where animals gather, where people travel, and where settlements appear. If you were moving through the desert, you would have to think constantly about wells, shade, and distance. A place like this trains attention in a particular way because survival often depends on noticing small things that others might overlook. And yet, for all its stillness, the Sahara is not as inactive as it first appears. In fact, it is one of the largest sources of atmospheric dust on Earth. Vast clouds of fine sediment rise from the desert and travel thousands of miles through the sky each year. Some of that dust eventually crosses the Atlantic Ocean before settling again, which means that tiny fragments of the Sahara regularly drift halfway across the planet. Occasionally rain does fall, and when it does, the landscape can respond surprisingly quickly. Dry river channels suddenly fill with water. Patches of grass appear within days. The land shifts almost as if it had been waiting quietly for the chance to grow again. And moments like that raise an interesting question. If the land can respond that quickly to a single storm, what might it look like if the rain came not once every few years, but every season? Because when scientists began studying the deeper history of this region, they discovered something surprising. The Sahara has not always been this dry. There were long stretches of time when rainfall pushed much farther north than it does today, transforming enormous areas of the desert. Which means the Sahara you see now may not be the landscape's permanent form. It may simply be the version of the land that exists during one phase of a much longer environmental rhythm. And that realization leads naturally to the next question. If the desert you know today is only one stage in that rhythm, what happened when the pattern shifted and the rains began moving north? The transformation of the Sahara began with something so small that it almost sounds like a joke. Nothing exploded. No oceans spilled across the land. The earth simply shifted its posture a little. Our planet does not spin in perfect stillness. Over long stretches of time, it wobbles slightly as it moves through space, like a spinning top that is very slowly adjusting itself. Most of the time, this wobble is far too gradual for anyone to notice, but it does change how sunlight falls across the seasons. During certain periods, summers in the northern hemisphere receive a little more sunlight than they do today, not dramatically more. Nothing that would make you step outside and say, "This feels unusually astronomical," but it was enough to strengthen the monsoon winds that carry moisture inland from the Atlantic Ocean. And once the monsoon strengthened, the rains began pushing north. This shift began roughly 15,000 years ago near the end of the last ice age, when warming temperatures and stronger summer sunlight allowed the African monsoon to expand far beyond its modern limits. At first, the change would have been easy to miss. A storm arriving where rain had once been rare. A few patches of grass appearing where the ground had been bare for years. But climate boundaries behave less like hard lines and more like habits. And habits can drift. Over centuries, the rain belt crept farther north. Places that had once seen only occasional storms began receiving seasonal rain. Valleys that had been dry most of the year started collecting water after storms. The desert did not disappear overnight, but it began loosening its grip on the landscape. And once dependable rain begins arriving somewhere, the land tends to respond with surprising enthusiasm. Seeds that have been waiting quietly in the soil begin to sprout. Grasses spread across open ground. Insects appear first, followed by birds that feed on them. Temporary pools form after storms, and frogs seem to arrive almost immediately, as if they had been waiting nearby the entire time. A place that once felt silent begins to develop a low background hum of life. Something interesting also begins happening once plants spread across the land. Sand is very bright. It reflects sunlight back into the sky. Vegetation is darker and it absorbs more of that sunlight instead. The ground warms slightly, warm air begins to rise, and rising air helps clouds form. Plants also release moisture from their leaves into the air through a process called transpiration, which is really just plants quietly breathing water vapor back into the atmosphere. So the landscape begins helping the rain continue. Rain grows plants. Plants help the air hold more moisture, and that moisture helps make more rain. It is a surprisingly cooperative system. Over time, the rains traveled remarkably far. The strengthened monsoon carried moist air deep into North Africa, reaching regions that today are dry rock and sand. Not every part of the desert became lush, but there was enough rain to transform enormous areas of the landscape. By roughly 10,000 to 7,000 BC, the Green Sahara had reached its peak. Grasslands spread across plains that had once been bare. Rivers flowed through valleys that are now empty channels. Water gathered in shallow basins, forming lakes scattered across the region. Some of those lakes became very large. One of them, now known as Mega Lake Chad, expanded dramatically during this humid period, reaching its greatest extent around 7,000 to 5,000 BC. At its peak, it covered roughly 150,000 to more than 350,000 square miles, making it one of the largest freshwater bodies on Earth at the time. If you had stood on its shoreline thousands of years ago, you would not have thought of it as a temporary lake. You would simply see water stretching to the horizon. Where water gathers, life follows. Fish filled the lakes. Crocodiles moved through rivers that no longer exist. Hippos drifted in calm shallows. Across the surrounding grasslands, animals that we now associate with wetter parts of Africa began moving north. Elephants wandered through river valleys. Giraffes browsed on scattered trees. Herds of grazing animals crossed open plains. The Sahara, which today feels like a vast barrier, began to look more like open country. And humans followed the water too. People settled near lakes and wetlands where fishing was reliable. Camps formed along rivers. Animal paths gradually became travel routes, linking distant regions together. Instead of avoiding the desert, people could move through it, following chains of water and vegetation across northern Africa. All of this unfolded during a long, wet interval known today as the African Humid Period. For thousands of years, rain returned season after season, feeding grasses, rivers, and lakes across a landscape that now appears almost impossibly dry. If you had lived there during that time, it would not have felt temporary. It would have felt like the normal order of things. The rains came, the grass followed, animals returned to familiar grazing grounds. Lakes filled and shrank with the seasons. Picture an ordinary evening. The wind moves through tall grass instead of across sand. Frogs call from the edges of shallow water. Insects drift above wetlands as the air cools. Somewhere in the fading light, a hippo surfaces in a lake while people sit beside a fire along the shoreline. For thousands of years, much of the Sahara looked like this. The silent dunes you picture today were not yet the defining feature of the landscape. Instead, there were lakes scattered across the region, rivers linking distant valleys, and wide grasslands supporting animals and people moving through a world organized around rain. In other words, the Sahara, that seems so dry and permanent today, was once something very different. For a long stretch of time, the desert turned green. As lakes and grasslands spread across the Sahara, people began settling around the water. Lakes gather life in a way few other environments do. Fish move through the shallows, birds settle into the reeds, herds arrive to drink along muddy shorelines. And before long, people begin organizing their lives around those same edges of water. During the African Humid Period, roughly 15,000 to 5,500 years ago, the Sahara supported far more people than the modern desert might suggest. It was not densely populated in the way agricultural regions would later become, but the landscape was full of dispersed communities. Fishing settlements beside lakes, small groups of hunter-gatherers moving through wetlands and grasslands, pastoral herders guiding cattle across open savannas, and seasonal camps scattered along rivers and floodplains. Across this enormous landscape, scientists estimate that perhaps 500,000 to more than 1 million people were living within the Green Sahara at its peak. They were spread out across thousands of kilometers, moving between water sources, grasslands, and seasonal resources in ways that fit the rhythms of a landscape organized around rain. One of the clearest glimpses of this lakeside world comes from a place called Gobero in what is now Niger. Today, Gobero lies among sand dunes. Wind moves across dry ground, where almost nothing grows. But beneath the desert surface, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected: the remains of entire communities, burials, tools, and traces of people who once lived beside deep freshwater lakes. Gobero tells its story in 2 layers. The earliest burials belong to fisher-hunters who lived beside the lakes during the wetter phase of the Sahara. Their tools include finely shaped bone harpoons and fishing implements designed for working in shallow water. The surrounding wetlands would have been full of fish, along with birds and animals drawn to the water. But above those older burials, archaeologists discovered another culture that appeared much later. These later inhabitants lived differently. Instead of relying primarily on fishing, they moved across the surrounding grasslands with herds of cattle. Chemical traces preserved in their pottery show residues of milk fats, suggesting that people here were already processing dairy products thousands of years ago. The change reflects the landscape around them. Lakes and wetlands still existed, but wide savannas now supported animals grazing across open plains. In other words, the people living in the Green Sahara adapted to the opportunities the environment offered. Some communities lived beside lakes where fishing remained reliable. Others followed grazing animals across seasonal grasslands. Camps appeared along rivers, wetlands, and lake shores, wherever water gathered long enough to support life. Travel across this landscape was also far easier than it is today. If you tried to cross the modern Sahara, it would require careful planning and long stretches of travel through extremely dry terrain. During the humid period, the geography looked very different. Rivers flowed through valleys that are now empty channels. Lakes filled basins scattered across the land. Grasslands stretched between them. These waterways and grazing lands formed natural pathways across northern Africa. Animals moved along those routes first. Herds traveled between grazing grounds. Predators followed the herds. Birds moved between wetlands and lakes. Over time, people began using the same pathways, moving from one water source to another across a landscape that connected regions which are now separated by desert. Instead of an empty barrier, northern Africa contained a patchwork of lakes, rivers, wetlands, and grasslands where animals and people moved across a living landscape. Traces of that world still appear in unexpected places, across cliffs and rock shelters throughout the Sahara. You can still find ancient carvings showing animals that seem strangely out of place in the modern desert. Cattle, crocodiles, hippos, and giraffes, animals that require far more water and vegetation than the region supports today. Other clues lie buried beneath the sand. Ancient lake beds preserve layers of pollen from grasses and wetland plants that once grew there. And far out in the Atlantic Ocean, cores taken from the seafloor show that during this humid period, the amount of dust blowing off the Sahara dropped dramatically, because much of the land that produces dust today was then covered in vegetation and water. Taken together, these traces reveal a Sahara that behaved very differently from the one you know now. Instead of dunes stretching to the horizon, there were networks of lakes and rivers across northern Africa. Grasslands supported animals moving across open plains. Communities gathered beside water where fishing, herding, and seasonal movement could support daily life. For thousands of years, this greener Sahara formed a vast living landscape organized around rain. But the forces that had created that world were still slowly shifting. Around 7,000 years ago, the same slow astronomical rhythms that had strengthened the African monsoon were changing again. Summers in the north grew slightly weaker, and the winds that once carried rain deep into the Sahara gradually lost some of their strength. At first, the change was subtle. Some seasons still brought storms that filled lakes and wetlands. In other years, the rains arrived late, or not at all. Water levels began slipping below their old shorelines. Marshes shrank along their edges. Grass that once covered the plains returned more thinly. On the scale of the planet, the shift was slow. The humid Sahara unraveled over roughly 1,000 to 2,000 years. But landscapes built around water can collapse much faster than that. A lake may shrink gradually for decades and still appear stable. Then one dry season arrives when the water falls below a critical level. Fish disappear. Wetlands dry. Wind begins sweeping across the exposed ground. Once that threshold is crossed, the transformation accelerates. Evidence from ancient lake beds suggests that this is exactly what happened in parts of the Sahara. Some lakes declined slowly over centuries. Others seem to have vanished within only a few generations. Places that had supported thriving ecosystems for thousands of years crossed ecological tipping points and changed very quickly. When lakes disappeared, the networks of life around them unraveled. Fish populations collapsed first. Birds abandoned shrinking wetlands. Grazing animals moved toward the remaining water. Grasslands that depended on seasonal rain thinned until patches of bare earth appeared between scattered plants. Once vegetation disappeared, wind began reshaping the land. Soil dried and loosened. Sand moved across the plains. Valleys that had once carried rivers became empty channels. Wet basins hardened into salt flats and dust. The living corridor that had once stretched across northern Africa slowly broke apart. Over the following centuries, the rains continued retreating south. Lakes evaporated, rivers vanished. Grasslands that had supported animals and people gave way to the dry winds and shifting sand that define the Sahara you see today. The desert returned. What had once been a landscape of lakes, rivers, and grazing animals gradually transformed into one of the largest arid regions on Earth. The water disappeared, the grasslands faded, the dunes that now stretch across the horizon slowly took shape. Now imagine living through that. Your camp sits along a shoreline that is growing harder to reach each season. The herding routes your family has always followed cross plains where the grass is becoming harder to find. The lake your grandparents fished is shrinking, and there is no way to know if it will ever come back. As the water retreated, people began following what remained of it. Some moved south toward regions where seasonal rains still arrived. Others traveled north toward the Mediterranean coast. Many followed the few rivers that continued to flow through the drying land. Over generations, these movements reshaped the human map of the region. Populations that had once lived across the open landscapes of the Sahara gradually gathered around the remaining sources of water. One of those water sources would become especially important, a long river flowing north through an increasingly dry world. The Nile, and the story of what happened along that river and how the Sahara repeatedly pushed people outward across continents is one of the ways this changing desert helped shape human history. For thousands of years, Saharan communities had built their lives around water that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. Fishing cultures had developed specialized tools for working shallow lakes and wetlands. Bone harpoons, fishing spears, and nets designed for capturing fish in slow-moving water. Hunters crafted stone points suited for the animals that moved across the grasslands. Pastoral groups guided cattle across wide grazing lands, managing herds that required careful knowledge of water, grass, and seasonal movement. These skills did not vanish when the lakes disappeared. They moved with the people. Archaeologists studying early Nile Valley settlements have noticed that many cultural practices appear there only after the Sahara begins drying. Evidence of cattle herding, for example, appears in Saharan contexts earlier than it does along the Nile itself. Rock carvings across the Sahara show cattle being herded across grasslands thousands of years before similar traditions become common along the river. Pottery styles, stone tools, and burial traditions also suggest connections between Saharan communities and early Nile populations. As the desert expanded, these different groups began gathering along a narrow corridor of dependable water. The Nile Valley was very different from the wide landscapes people had left behind. Instead of open plains stretching across hundreds of kilometers, life was now concentrated along a long ribbon of fertile land that flooded each year. If you had made that journey, walking out of a dying desert toward the only river still running, this valley would have felt like arriving somewhere that had a future. The river's annual flood left behind fresh soil ideal for growing crops. But the same river that created this fertile land also demanded careful management. Fields had to be organized. Water had to be directed into channels and basins. Settlements began clustering along predictable sections of the floodplain. Over time, managing life along the river required new systems. Irrigation channels helped guide floodwater into fields. Land along the floodplain became valuable enough that communities needed ways to define territory. Leaders emerged who could organize labor for building canals, managing water, and storing food. Gradually, the Nile Valley became one of the most densely inhabited landscapes in the region. Out of this concentration of people, ideas, and resources, a new kind of society began to take shape. Villages grew into towns. Regional leaders competed for influence along the river. Trade moved along the Nile from one settlement to another. By around 3100 BCE, these developments culminated in the emergence of one of the world's earliest unified states, ancient Egypt. The temples, pyramids, and cities that later rose along the Nile were built by societies shaped by this long environmental story. People concentrating along a single reliable river as the landscapes around them dried. For a long time, archaeologists studying this history thought of the drying Sahara as a single dramatic turning point, a great environmental crisis that pushed people toward the Nile and helped set the stage for one of the world's first civilizations. But as scientists began reconstructing ancient climates in more detail, something surprising became clear. This story had happened before, many times. The Sahara has not always been a desert. Over the past several 100,000 years, it has repeatedly swung between two very different states. During certain orbital cycles, the monsoon expands northward, and the desert becomes grassland and lakes. Thousands of years later, the rains retreat again, and the desert returns. Each time the Sahara turns green, animals and people spread across northern Africa. Each time the desert returns, those populations move outward again toward regions where water still exists. Scientists now refer to this long cycle as the Sahara pump. Like a slow geological heartbeat, the desert opens pathways across the continent and then closes them again. Wet periods allow animals and humans to travel through landscapes that are normally impassable. Dry periods push those same populations outward toward other regions where water remains. Over immense spans of time, these movements helped mix human populations across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. And the scale of those movements reaches even deeper into our species' past. Long before the rise of Egyptian civilization, one of the earliest great migrations of human history began when small groups of modern humans left Africa roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. From there, our species spread outward across the planet, into Europe, across Asia, into Australia, and eventually across the Pacific to the islands of Polynesia. Think about that for a moment. Every human being alive today is descended from people who made journeys like that, walking out of one dying landscape and into the unknown, following water, following animals, following whatever small signs suggested that life might be possible somewhere just over the horizon. The Sahara's shifting climate likely played a role in shaping when those northern routes across Africa were open and when they were closed. In that sense, the story of the Green Sahara is not just about one desert turning green. It is about one of the largest landscapes on Earth, repeatedly opening and closing corridors for life. And over thousands of generations, those movements helped shape the map of human populations across much of the world. The Sahara, in other words, has not only been one of the largest deserts on Earth, it has also been one of the quiet engines, moving people across continents. Today, the Sahara appears almost lifeless. Wind moves across dunes. Sand drifts slowly across open plains. The landscape feels ancient and permanent, as if it has always been this way and always will be. But the Sahara is still moving. Every year, powerful winds lift enormous clouds of fine mineral dust from the desert surface and carry them high into the atmosphere. From there, the dust begins a journey that stretches thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. If you could watch from space, you would actually be able to see these vast plumes leaving Africa and drifting westward across the sea. Eventually, much of that dust falls again, not back into the desert, but into the Amazon rainforest. The soils of the Amazon are surprisingly poor in certain nutrients. Heavy tropical rains wash minerals out of the ground over time, leaving the forest dependent on outside sources of nutrients to replace what is lost. One of the most important of those sources turns out to be the Sahara. Each year, tens of millions of tons of Saharan dust settle across the Amazon basin, carrying phosphorus and other minerals that help fertilize the forest. In a sense, the largest desert on Earth is quietly helping sustain one of the largest rainforests. Sand becomes soil, dust becomes forests. The same desert that once held lakes, grasslands, animals, and people is still influencing ecosystems on the other side of the planet. Landscapes rarely stay still for long. Deserts can become wetlands. Grasslands can become sand. Rivers can gather civilizations along their banks, and then shift their course again thousands of years later. The Sahara reminds you that the landscapes we think of as permanent are often just one moment in a much longer rhythm. 7,000 years ago, this desert held lakes large enough to hide entire civilizations along their shores. 7,000 years from now, the rhythm of the planet may shift again, and somewhere beneath the sand, the seeds of another green Sahara may still be waiting, resting quietly, until the rhythms of the earth decide it is time again.